For being here. I see some new faces. I'm glad everybody stuck with us with the rescheduling and canceling. I know it's been kind of a rough year to get us started, but thank you for being here tonight. I'm very excited. I think this is going to be a wonderful presentation. My name is Jessica. I'm the president of the St. Louis Carnivorous Plant Society. We are going to go ahead and do our presentation first since we are streaming tonight. So let me give, most of you probably know Greg, but let me give him a little bit of an introduction. This is Dr. Gregory Heck. He's been part of our society since 2021 when we sort of reformed after COVID. He's served as the board member and the secretary, and he's been pivotal in just helping us get...
This is not working.
But just to get things restructured and rolling again after taking, a couple-year break from that. He's a retired plant molecular biologist, so he has...
Clip it on, that's my problem.
A vast technical knowledge, but really a wonderful ability to make that information accessible to growers at every stage. We've been so fortunate to have him be part of our society. He's given presentations with us. He's given presentations to other societies on our behalf. Mm-hmm. He's manned our information table at the show and sale. So just a wealth of knowledge. And he has a beautiful collection of his own, mostly the really hard to grow plants, the cephalotus and helianthera and beautiful Nepenthes. But he's also shared those with us with different demonstrations, show and tell plants, and then cutting off some really magnificent pictures for our show and sale table. I know that was painful, but hundreds of people got to hold them and look at these plants, so really a sacrifice we appreciate. Well, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to him. He had the opportunity to go to Borneo, and that's what he's going to share with us tonight. So let's go ahead and welcome Dr. Gregory Heck.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the turnout. This is an opportunity to share a little. You're going to see a lot of pictures. I encourage people to ask questions during rather than trying to save anything up at the end. It's always a little bit of trepidation to show other people your vacation photos because they just kind of glaze over very quickly. But I think given this crowd and what you're probably interested in, it's going to be interesting because my whole impetus was to see these plants, where they exist, how they exist. That was the thing. I've got a grow tent full of them, which is wonderful. But, seeing them in the wild, interacting with all the stuff they interact with, fantastic. So anyway, to sort of give you the overall sort of scope of it is I flew around the planet and ended up in Singapore initially. From there, going to Sabah, Malaysia, and going to Trusmati and Timba, Yukon, which, if you ever see, Nepenthes, sometimes you'll see Edwardsiana, Timba, Yukon, or something like that. That's because if they occur on more than one mountain, they will often add the name because there's some variation. So anyway, we went to several different locations and then also to see some in the Philippines as well. So there's a little intrigue around that, but I'll get to it as we go through. Starting in Singapore, highly recommend. If you've seen Crazy Rich Asians, this is the place to go. It's every bit that and more. I've been there a few times for work and other things, but it's spectacular. One of the most expensive places on earth, but also, just fascinating. You can live as high as you want or as low as you want, and there's lots of in between. But flying in, got to arrive at the airport. Keep doing that. At the airport, this is outside of baggage claim. So there's a botanical gardens there in the airport, and there's this glass dome that has a waterfall. This falls through the floor several stories, and there's food courts down there, and it's just an acrylic tube. and there you can see the tram that takes you to different parts of the airport. When we were there for the International Orchid Show back in 2011, I think it was, we toured the airport for 4.5 hours. They have botanical gardens, they have a butterfly garden, orchid shows were happening at that time in the airport. There's shopping, restaurants, you can go swimming on the rooftop. It's a destination, and the massage chairs are free, so it's fantastic. So anyway, but lots there. This is a bridge that's supposed to be like DNA made out of stainless steel. We stayed initially when we went there for the orchid show in the Marina Bay Sands. So that's, if you've seen the movie Crazy Rich Asians, that's the pool is on top of that building. So anyway, Singapore, fantastic. It feeds into another thing that I really love, which is the aquatic gardens. So Bob here is from the Water Garden Society. Outside of their art and science building are hundreds of tropical water lilies in a giant pool that wraps around. So got to see plenty of that. But really what I wanted to see in Singapore, not only to recover from the jet lag, was to go to the Gardens by the Bay, which is one of the 2 botanical gardens that are present there in Singapore. And what's interesting here is I think most of this land is actually reclaimed from the sea, so it's landfill, basically. But they have 2 domes. When I went there for the International Orchid Show, this dome was open, their flower dome. This dome over here, which is their rainforest dome, was not open at that time. It was still under construction. So that was like my target goal. Also, the super trees were not finished at that time, so had a lot to see when we went back there. But you can see there's a park and a pool and a whole lot of other stuff up on this rooftop, 50-something stories above. But here we are in the actual park itself, and these are the super trees, which are obviously synthetic structures, but they've cloaked them in epiphytes, so the whole things are just covered in bromeliads, staghorn ferns, bougainvillea, everything, and you can walk in here. There's even, I think, a restaurant, which you can't see from this standpoint in one of them, but completely well done. They're lit up at night, light shows, the whole 9 yards. But really, again, the goal was to get to the dome. So the Cloud Forest Dome is interesting because it's their attempt to replicate cooler environments in some place like Singapore, which is not cool. So cool aesthetically, but not cool temperature-wise. It's definitely would be, from a Nepenthes standpoint, a lowland environment. I mean, it's 85 degrees like all year round, even at night, lots of humidity. So what they wanted to do was create an environment where they could control, and they have incredibly intricate climate controls here. But what they attempted to do and have done is create this 100-foot high mountain. So it's 100 feet high within the dome itself. And you take an elevator to the top, and then there's a catwalk system, and you spiral around. You know, there's lookouts every so often. You can see, like, here's a view from one of the lookouts, and there's a lot of levels. And what's interesting is this thing is covered in everything you can imagine. I mean, just incredible specimens of aroids and begonias, and I was hoping we would see some Nepenthes there. And so we did. At the very top, where you get out of the elevator, is a pool and a series of Chihuly sculptures and things like that. You can see here the Marina Bay over, looking from the other side. And this is actually one of the best displays in Nepenthes I've seen in a botanical garden. It still wasn't as good, I think, as it could be. But, given all the stuff that was going on there, it was pretty amazing and pretty well done. They had, a truncata in flower. They had a whole bunch of other species, which you typically don't see a nice big specimen plant of. But the thing that I really thought was interesting beyond the Nepenthes were the rhododendrons. So one thing I didn't appreciate or know so much were the Virrea rhododendrons. And so they're tropical. They occur high in the mountains. They grow in cool environments. And actually, some of the carnivorous plant growers now here in the States are offering them. I know Floro Collaborative has been selling a few of them in their auctions. I know they've got a lot more in propagation. But what's interesting, there's hundreds of species. They all occur high in the mountains. They're colorful in ways that our rhododendrons simply are not. And they had tons of them in bloom, all because they could control the climate and keep it cooler by far. So it was like we were like several thousand feet up on a mountainside experiencing these plants. So I was hoping to see some of these in the wild, and I did. Not these exact ones, but I was able to see some. So anyway, that's the preface. This is the way station. What we wanted to do was actually go on something that was billed as the Giant Nepenthes Expedition. And so you may have heard the name Stuart McPherson. So he certainly has books, like a lot of really good books. He was leading it himself. So he on these expeditions takes about 8 people or so. It's partly limited because you're going into national parks where they strictly control trafficking through the park. So you have to have permits months in advance, all these sorts of things. And they're very serious. I mean, like super serious about like having your ducks in a row when you go in. But again, you can see from this particular image, this is Loei in the wild. I mean, this is Loei in the wild. Massive plant. As Stuart was telling us, he thinks that some of these plants that we were seeing, no proof, but he's pretty sure that these plants, some of them are hundreds of years old. They die back occasionally and regrow, but he said, the girth on them and everything, they've got to be pretty seriously entrenched in the places that they're found. But just to give you a little backstory, this is through Redfern, so you may have heard that. They have all sorts of books that you can buy. We actually have the Nepenthes books here in our collection, so you can check these out if you're a member. And so I encourage that. They're fantastic, but he's got books on Drosera, books on, helium-4. I think he's preparing a helium-4 text, but definitely the Nepenthes. He's hiked up hundreds of these mountains in Southeast Asia, and is very convinced that there are still yet many species of Nepenthes yet to be discovered, because so many of them are extremely localized. I mean, you have to go to this side of this one mountain to find a particular species. Some of them are broadly distributed, but many of them are extremely localized. And because some of these areas, like in the Philippines, are under military, rebel control and so forth, they're not very friendly. And so getting there in and out if you're on an expedition is tough, even when there isn't like someone trying to shoot at you. Anyway, he's an authority, but through his organization, they do a lot of outreach to children, schools, education. A lot of the materials are distributed free around the world. So he spends a lot of his time fundraising to allow this to happen. And they're also right now, I'm not sure if it's still going on right now or whether it's finished up, but they're recreating the travels of the Beagle, so Darwin's ship. They've got this sailing ship, and it's going completely around the world and stopping all the places that Darwin has done, and then they do like sort of ecological education projects wherever they go. And so he hops on the boat and goes for a while and then gets off the next port and runs an expedition and comes back, that kind of thing. Amazing man. So, he's hard to get hold of. It took me a long time to be able to get to go on this expedition because he doesn't answer his email. And so, if you can get a hold of him and get his attention, he's fantastic. So.
How did you get a hold of him then?
It was email, but I tried and didn't hear anything. And there was supposed to be an expedition, and then 6 months later, I think I got an email back from them. And it's like, oh, we're going to have one. Are you interested? And I'm like, well, sure. So it's then it was a scramble to get the vaccinations and all that sort of stuff. But it all worked out just fine. And that's what we're here for today. But here's the overall. Actually, I can go back a little bit, but I think I can do it here. So we flew into Singapore. So that was, recover a little bit. And then we had to fly to Kota Kinabalu. That was the jumping off point. So this is Borneo, so it's a little cut off, but this island here is the third largest island in the world, behind Greenland and Papua New Guinea, and then it's Borneo. So, but there's 3 countries. It's sort of like North America. There's 3 countries sort of all situated there. So part of it is Malaysia, which kind of is this line here. Below that is Indonesia, and stuck right in there is a very tiny country called Brunei. And so they're all there. Malaysia is fantastic. I think it's extremely safe. The people are friendly. It was a good situation. They value their national parks tremendously. It's certainly a source of tourism for them. They understand this, and so they're doing a lot to preserve what they can in these areas. Although that said, much native forest has been stripped away for oil palm. So the ranges of a lot of these orchids and Nepenthes and other associated tropicals is extremely restricted now because it just doesn't exist anymore and the way it was. And so we did that, and then eventually we did travel over to Puerto Princesa, Palawan. So this is one of the islands of the Philippines. It's actually not this pretty in the sense of we had to fly to Manila because there's no direct flights after COVID. And so then fly back, and it was just a lot of running around, but beautiful island. There's about 7,000 islands here, 2,000 inhabited roughly, and 5,000 are very tiny and not inhabited. But extremely diverse. Some places you really wouldn't want to go to because militant factions and so forth are not your friend. But Palawan is pretty stable, pretty safe, and we'll go from there. So where are we going? Mountains. And so the biggest mountains in Borneo are all situated right near Kota Kinabalu. And so Kota Kinabalu is the tallest of them. These are all mountains that have been thrust up, granite, hard mineral. So you might have heard of ultramafic soils. Sometimes certain folks say that that's good for growing Nepenthes of particular types. Generally, the ones that are on these particular types of mountains, because as those minerals erode, they form clays and soils that are rich in minerals, low in nutrients, but rich in minerals. And so that's where you kind of get that stuff. But high, 2.5 miles sea level. We did not go to Kinabalu, although you could see it. It's hard not to see because it's so dominating. We did go to Tuzmati first, and then we went to Timbayukan, which are almost exactly at the same height. These are tall mountains. They get cool, which is the important point here. Nepenthes grow almost all the way to the very tops of these mountains. So your nights might be in the 50s, sometimes in the 40s. There's no snow. I think on rare occasions, Kinabalu gets snow, but that's not typical, although it does drop down near freezing. So we didn't get here, but these are really the iconic mountains. So the species I'm going to talk about and show are really the classics, the ones that you see in the magazines, you see people making hybrids of, and for good reasons. So they're stunning. But altitude matters. So depending on where you are on the mountain is what you're going to see. And so we saw mostly the intermediate elevations. So significantly above sea level, not all the way to the top. So we really didn't see any lowland Nepenthes, the ones that like temperatures above 70 degrees at night. We saw the stuff that was more moderate to maybe seeing 40s and 50 degrees at night. So we had to dress appropriately. So that was part of the challenge. But what's interesting is we could see in Tuzmati 4 species, and they kind of work in zones. So there is overlap. So it's not as rigidly structured as I have it here, but there is sort of an ordering based on altitude. So you will see some things at some places and not others, although tentaculata is everywhere. Every mountain above like 2,000 feet has tentaculata on it. So it's very broad, it's diverse. I think it even occurs on Sulawesi, which is the next big island over next to Borneo. So some of them are broad, but most of these are really restricted, like macrophylla, only on this mountain. And Loei occurs on a couple mountains, I think maybe 3. but not very many. And then Zachariana, which I labeled Fusca, which I didn't understand the distinction for a long time, but it's because it's a very diverse species, and it's now been split. So Fusca is the name given to the species, the former species that's found in like Sulawesi and other places, and the one that's found on Borneo is called Zachariana. So.
And what are we talking about? Is it a small group of them, or is it lots?
It depends where you are. Okay. So I would say for most of these, there's not a million of them in one spot, but you see them over and over for a given altitude. Tentaculata, you just come across it all the time, and you're like, oh, not another one, right? You're sort of like, it's like I've seen too many.
Most of them are not endangered yet.
Most of them are endangered.
They are.
At some level, simply because of the restricted nature of their distribution. They're not really everywhere. So again, like macrophylla, one mountain. And so, environmental change over time. That can impact it. This is not being converted to oil palm or anything like that, but, poaching is a big thing. So these are popular in the trade, particularly the iconic species. And so poaching is a huge deal, even though it's a national park, and you will basically be shot, for stealing plants. But, you can't, they have a small workforce, and so you can't police a mountain per se. So plants get poached a lot, and some of them like Clipiata, which we didn't see here, but Clipiata is functionally extinct in the wild because of poaching. It exists, because it grows on cliffs, but in a few accessible spots, but there's so few individuals spaced so widely apart, and they're either male or they're female, that the chances of one is going to pollinate the other one living. So when this generation dies out, there will be no more, except for what's in cultivation. So I would say many are endangered. Some, like Zachariana, not, because it's found broadly across Borneo, but most are not in that situation. And similarly, Tambayukan, 7 species, one mountain, it's fantastic. And these are like the iconics, Verbigidae, Lowii, Edwardziana. Edwardziana is not unique to Tambayukan, but it's there. Raja, and then Velosa, spectacular. These are growing, Velosa is basically growing on the summit. So it's ultra Highlander. So I think, Jacob tried to grow it in a refrigerator, which people do to make it happy. I'm not that bold, and it's just too hard, so I do a hybrid. So I would say, pick your battles when you're growing plants, but Tentaculata all over the place. Zachariana at the lower altitudes. But I've got real pictures, and we can see more as we move through. But this is the crew. So this is the entirety of the expedition. Pretty diverse group of individuals. Most of us were from the US, not everybody. Kok was from the Netherlands. Ben was actually from Malaysia, but his parents sent him to boarding school in London. And so, he was back for that. Michael was from France, so a little bit international. But this was the troop that was going to go up. And Sue was actually interesting. She's like a dentist from Indiana, and she has no interest in Nepenthes or carnivorous plants, but she just thought it would be cool. And so it's like, given how brutal, she went on the first part of the expedition, which I didn't go on, because I figured my husband, it would be too much to ask to add another almost 5 days onto the beginning of it. And, it's like, again, pick your battles. I'm not going to grow Velosa, and I'm not going to have him go another 5 days. They got rained on to the point where they're slogging through mud a foot deep, and it was, I can't imagine. And it wasn't even to see an interesting set of species. I know, right? But anyway, she was a trooper. Ed was there. Coco's interesting because he's a retired lichenologist, so from the Netherlands. So he was like photographing every little bit of lichen that was around. So anyway, interesting. But here's my bucket list. So I have bucket list items. One bucket list item was to see Rafflesia in the wild flowering. So if you don't know Rafflesia, Rafflesia is the largest flower in the world, single flower. And I mean, you've probably seen like the corpse flower here at the Botanical Gardens. That's multiple flowers. It's inflorescence. It's a big spray of very tiny flowers and a lot of other stuff going on. These are single flowers. The largest of them, which we did not see that species because it doesn't occur where we were, has flowers almost a meter across, single flowers. They're interesting because they have unique lifestyle. They're parasites, basically. So there are 3 species. We were able to see 2 of them, Pricei and Keithii. So that was pretty amazing. What's interesting is that they are parasites. They're restricted to one single genus of plants called Tetrastigma. It's related to grape. It grows tropical. They live inside the plant body, and then they only emerge to flower. And so it's like you would never know they're there until they flower, and they come out of the ground, basically. No. It's, they're not good, but at the same time, they're not bad enough to kill the host. And it seems rather specific that, like, they're totally obligated. Like, the entire genus of Rafflesia only works on this genus of vine. And so it's extremely specific. They're found all over in the Philippines, Southeast Asia in general. Although Palomon, oddly, no one has ever described a Rafflesia species there. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, Stuart said. It's just they're just, finding the flower at the right time, super hard to do. So anyway, this is it. Pricei. Day it opened, we were there, and spectacular. And they're kind of stinky, not as bad as like a Titanarum. Probably gnats are their biggest thing. So why you need such a large flower for gnats, who knows? But they come out of the ground. We were able to see buds. So here's a bud coming on, and this is freshly open. They last maybe 3 or 4 days. And again, the biggest ones are like a meter. This is like dinner plate size. So it's not the biggest species by any stretch. But here's Keithii, a little gone by. We saw buds. But this one this is probably about a day 4 flower, but it was probably close to 2 feet across, getting a little gone by in effort. But what was interesting about this one, you could probably see, this is like a mesh fencing. So this was actually in a Rafflesia reserve. So, folks have decided that, ecotourism is a good thing. And so when farmers know that there's a plant that's producing, they will put a fence around it and charge people a few dollar equivalents to go in and check them out. And so there's a small sort of cottage industry for making sure you're preserving this particular species on your property. And so, and what I had back here, this is actually a Rafflesia like mini museum. So that's where they had all these like models that were made of all the species and so forth. So it's like the only place in the world you can go.
Greg, what's the frequency of the bloom? In other words, how often? Anyone know?
Every once in a while.
Okay.
So you kind of need to know where they are.
Yeah.
And so the guides that we talk to know the forest so well, they can sort of gauge where it's likely to happen, but it doesn't happen every year or, question.
Are they endangered?
I would say probably not as much because the vine grows broadly. I guess it's a good question, though, how many of those vines are infected. So I think there are just unanswered questions about how endangered they might really be, because it's not only that the host plant is there, but you have to distribute the seed. So there's questions about how seed is even distributed and where it goes and how it gets to the plant, and big questions. Despite being such a charismatic flower and everybody knows it and recognizes it. I mean, you go to the airport in Kota Kinabalu and the bathroom has a rafflesia like painted on the wall, so people get it, that it's unique and it's special. But here's tentaculata, different versions. So there's biological variation in a species that's so broadly distributed up and down the mountain and then mountain to mountain. So these are just a few pictures of ones we saw. I think most of these are probably lowers. This might be an upper. So a distinction with Nepenthes is often the sort of the keels, little toothy arrangements tend to be on basal pitchers, but not on the upper pitchers when they vine. It's not necessarily hard and fast, and they often tend to lose color and become different in form as they go up. So this might be an upper, but the thing that's really distinguishing tentaculata is this very sort of pointed oval elliptical mouth, distinctive, very characteristic. And so you can easily tell, oh, that's tentaculata when you come across one. But it's everywhere, and this is getting up into the range where we saw lowii. And so this is high up in the mountain. We are in the clouds at this point, and so there was a tentaculata just sitting on a stump, essentially growing epiphytically, but then it was also, there are other places where it's like weaving through the moss, and there's like a pitcher like every few inches as you go through. So spectacular tiny species.
How many plants is that?
Oh, that one, it's hard to tell.
Okay.
But it's vining in this case, so that could be maybe a small number. I wouldn't say it's many in this case. But this is Zacchariana, so this is at lower mid altitudes. We were seeing this species broadly distributed, a bit diverse, but I included it in part because it shows really clearly. I was able to see the lower and the upper pitchers and how distinctly different they are. So they go through lifestyle changes, and so this is the thing. Like when I see somebody's growth chamber or their grow tent, like just packed with 2-inch pots of seedlings, it's like that's going to be a big plant, and it's going to vine. So as they begin to go up, they vine and they clamber and they move into the trees and they go over bushes and so forth. And so you will need to plan ahead. But here's a lower, very dark colored, distinctively different than this is the upper. So the other thing that when you transition from a lower to an upper is that tendril, the thing that dangles down and forms the pitch at the end, becomes active when it becomes an upper. So it will like wind around something. So this particular plant, which I cut out from the background, but there was must have been like a leaf or something, and it tried to curl around it. And that's to grip as it vines up. So it uses those tendrils not only to hold the pitcher, but also to vine. And here is actually the contents of an upper pitcher. So one of the distinctions in the color is thought to bring in different prey. So more flying insects as they go up into the upper parts of the canopy.
Slightly off topic, but how many of those giant, like Malaysian-style bugs did you see?
Oh, just wait.
Oh, okay. See those at the zoo, and all the ones that are like a foot long. All those bugs are all.
Well, I didn't see any that were a foot long, but we saw bucket list items. But what was cool about the Zacchariana was that because there was so much of it available, we could see the different life stages very easily without struggling. So here's the male flowers, so pollen. Nepenthes flowers are extremely boring. There's almost nothing to them. They just have like 4 tepals and, either pollen on a fused stigma, or they have, a carpel. And so this has actually been pollinated. It's setting seed. This is the female plant. Again, male, female plants are distinctly different individuals. And then I was able to also see a bunch of seedlings just growing in the moss. So, the fact that you could see all of those stages was pretty cool. And, some of the other stuff, just because there's stuff everywhere, I mean, literally everywhere, on the trees, on the rocks. The ferns were incredible. So red fern, so, that's not the botanical name, but that's where Stuart got the name of his natural history company, was from red fern. But, stuff like this is weird fishtail. And filmy ferns. Filmy ferns are interesting. They need like really high moisture. They're basically the leaf, portion is one cell thick. So, drying out is a serious issue. So unless you're by a waterfall or basically living in a cloud, you're going to have issues. So you don't see filmy ferns outside of these really moist environments. And then, this is a species, and I've forgotten the name, but it basically occurs globally because it grows high on mountains, and its spores are carried by the wind. And so basically anywhere that you're, circumnavigating the equator, you'll find it. It rambles, it just splits and has these vining sort of habits that just go and go and go. So, it's interestingly pretty, but it's almost like a weed, which, basically it is. Other stuff, moss. Of course, there's sphagnum, which, I'm happy to see that in the wild. But then there's stuff like this, which, it comes up and forms like a little, like a Whoville, tree, where it's just, spectacular. Saw the largest moss in the world, Dawsonia superba. So, this is a small one. So, I was reading reports, I think on Timbuyukan, it can grow up to almost a meter tall. And so serious moss, spectacular, different forms of it. There's a red moss in the background behind some that was growing on a rock face. So other things that are related, liverworts. So, I know what a liverwort looks like conventionally. It basically looks like this, which is, we saw that on a log there. So great. But then I didn't know there was this whole world of leafy liverworts. And I'm almost 100% sure this is a leafy liverwort, where the sort of blades of it are packed in really tight, and it grows in these segments. So fantastic, but I'm pretty sure this is a liverwort. Lichens, tons of lichens everywhere. So Koch, the guy that was a retired lichenologist, bonkers. He would just you wouldn't see him for long periods of time. But just the forms and everything, fantastic. And this is one thing that I didn't appreciate till we saw it here, is that this is actually a Burbigiae, in its vining phase. But these longer, and this is an orchid leaf with a filmy fern, but these guys, because they live long enough as a leaf, that they actually pick up, mosses, liverworts, lichens on the leaf surface, and they're called epiphyls as a generic term, but they're on there. There are lichens that will colonize very fast and move across the leaf during the year or two that leaf is actually available. And they specialize in many cases and are not found outside of other plant leaf surfaces. So fascinating. So anyway, that's interesting, but we got to talk about bugs. So rhinoceros beetles. So we stayed at a little hotel before we ascended the mountain, Truzmati, and there were a little LED light outside of each room, and bugs were coming in. It was fantastic. I mean, rhinoceros beetles, like that big. So, my husband here was not thrilled, but that's Stuart's hand, But I'm pretty sure these are different species. There are just so many. So like you can sort of look at the ornamentation and it's different. That's actually, I think, a dung beetle. Here's the females. And again, I think these are different species. So the males are definitely bigger. There's a male in my hand for scale, and they fly. So it's, they're not like very adept. They're kind of like a tank, just like crash into stuff. But, talk about, wingspan like this and like flying. So serious bugs. So not a foot, but, pound for pound, they're pretty generous. Moths were interesting. I think, what was really interesting were all the camouflage versions of them. So many of them had interesting colors, but other ones, like this one, rolled its wings up so that it looked like a little bit of dead twig. So cool. But Truzmati, this is where, we began. That was the first. This is a more, quote, popular mountain in the sense of the amount of tourism that it gets. So the first part of the leg up the mountain was actually like a boardwalk. And so, there was a little sort of, hotel is generous. It was mostly bunk beds and like a few rooms, and they could cook for you. So there was that. And so that was our way station. And then the next day we went up to the mountain. And then the third day we went all the way back down. So that was sort of the basic trajectory. But these are the species that we're going to see. We're ascending to the top, which is almost 9,000 feet. So brisk and cool and in the clouds, but really nice. So this is the kind of climb with stairs. And so the trail is really obvious. The trail is not always obvious. And so we would have a guide at the beginning and we'd have a guide at the end of the group. You didn't have to stay with everybody, but those folks would sort of watch out to make sure that nobody was left behind. That said, I had serious points of concern during some parts of the hike when I wasn't with somebody else, because I'm like, I don't know if this is a trail. So sure, someone could be following, but if they don't know I'm on the trail that I'm not on, then I'm like, I don't know what's going to happen. But we all survived. We all came back. That's great. But there was Cook, like, ascending. They had put like wire mesh on everything, which I think was actually more hazardous because it got wet, because everything was wet like all the time. And so that, with hiking boots was kind of slippery. Well, lots of things growing, so lichens, moss, liverworts. But here we are. Nepenthes loei was like the first big bucket species that we wanted to see. This is one of the guides behind me. She took a picture of me taking a picture because she thought I looked like Santa. And so that thrilled her in some kind of way. I didn't know exactly how to take that. I think I took it as a compliment, but like she was reading me in some fashion, I'm sure. But this is loei, like it's a spectacular species. And we'll go into a little bit why it's so spectacular. But we saw multiple plants, not high density, not like Zachariana, not like Tentaculata, but once you were at the altitude where loei would be found, you saw a lot of it. Obviously there's liquid in it. These things feel like wood, so they don't produce very many, but there's a lot of investment in each picture, and there's a reason for that, which I'll get to in a second. But they're climbing in the trees. Sometimes you wouldn't see them unless you were looking up. And these trails are like, it's slippery, there's mud, you're like grabbing roots so you don't fall, things like that. And so unless you look up occasionally, you would sometimes miss them. And but they would be up in the trees, vining eventually. Got to see it in flower. So there's a male plant in flower, a young pitcher in formation. But the thing that's interesting about it is scat. So basically, these are species that are adapted to feces. So they, once you form a pitcher, you can do a lot with it. It's really a collection device. So you can collect an insect, or you can collect a dropping. And so, nitrogen's nitrogen, not picky. It's a harsh environment. And here is actually, you can see, like, It didn't all flush down yet. And so, you know, so it's there. And this is, I didn't take this picture. This is a little Wikipedia or something, because I saw one, but, you know, by the time you see it, you can't take a picture of it. But the tree shrew is everywhere, and it caters to tree shrews. And so what's interesting is that, and you can maybe get a little bit of a view here, but it will secrete abundant nectar in that sort of cupped lid. So this is an upper pitcher. It doesn't look like the lower pitcher at all. Actually, we didn't see any juveniles. At least I didn't. I was looking for them. The juveniles are quite distinctive and different. So the juvenile pitchers, the lid opens and there's all these hairs, like spiky hairs that are very stiff, that stick out. So it's structured differently than the adult pitcher quite a bit. It's thought that the spiky stuff is sort of like, you know, those dog bowls where they have all the projections to keep your dog from eating too fast. They think that's, for a younger plant, they want the shrew to linger longer, and so it slows them down.
So that's the pollinator?
It's not the pollinator. I think pollinators are generally flies and things like that. So no, they are the source of nutrients. Okay. And so what's interesting is, see, this is sort of like, it's a constricted neck. They don't want to eat the shrew. They want the shrew to sit on here and lick the nectar. So the distance between here and here is the distance between the head and the butt. And so it's very well constructed. And the nectar also contains a laxative. And so, you know, a little something for everyone, right? And so it's structured that way. And actually, lowii is not the only species that caters to this. It's the iconic species, and it's probably the principal one. But other Nepenthes have glommed onto this like gold mine of nutrients. And so we can talk about that in a minute. So clouds. So we're up in the clouds at this point. We're getting close to the summit. So there's just moisture everywhere. There's orchids just stuck on trees. Fantastic. Here's some of those array of rhododendrons. We didn't see any of the really flashy yellow ones and stuff, but certainly when you come across something like this, when everything is green and brown, really stand out, which I think is the whole point from the flower standpoint. Lots of orchids from extreme miniature bulbophyllums. Bulbophyllums are everywhere. What is this? You would probably know, but lots of stuff, and it wasn't even a particularly good time of year. And so we saw jewel orchids. I saw orchids shedding seeds, just blowing in the wind. More rhododendrons. But here we are, 8370, in terms of elevation, and we came upon Macrophylla, which is the first iconic toothy species that we actually hit. So this is, again, bucket list to see Macrophylla in the wild. It only occurs on this mountain. And, it's a big toothy species, but it's called Macrophylla for macro, like really big leaves. Again, this is an older plant. Again, Stuart had no verification, but he's pretty sure some of these things die back and are like decades to hundreds of years old in the wild. So very vulnerable to poaching. You chop this down, then what do you get beyond it? So there's dead pitchers, but certainly plenty of healthy live pitchers available. Look at that diameter. This is a vine going through the trees. This is Macrophylla. Yeah, right? It's serious. So again, fantastic. There's variation even within such a singular species where you had stubby, not so red pitchers to things like this, which are just stunning. Like when like, oh my gosh, and it's like they just pop out of, you turn the corner, so to speak, and there it is. But what? Mostly palms. I don't think we saw anything that I would say was a cycad. So, but tons of palms everywhere. So they were abundant, lots of ferns, but that I don't think any cycads. But anyway, embrace scat again. So this is another species. Lugii is just a slightly lower elevation overall. Again, they do overlap. It's not super strict. But here, look, you know, somebody's been there. And so the structure seems quite different to me. But somehow, you know, they want that nectar. They can, maybe the ribbing or something allows them to gain a good foothold. And, you know, the plant benefits in the end. They'll probably trap a few insects here and there, but it's really sort of, you know, getting that you know, waste nutrient input that is driving them. But because these things do overlap geographically, you can get hybrids. So you can basically cross any two Nepenthes. You know, I've heard some occasional weird reports where someone can't cross something, but there's usually like a chromosomal abnormality of some sort. But if they're just, you know, a regular species, you know, if you can get pollen to the stigma, you're done. And so it happens. So it happens here to the point where there's actually sort of a fake species name made called Chusmatiensis, so named after the mountain. It's the cross between Loia and Macrophylla. I did not take this picture. It's Wikipedia, but you see something that looks kind of intermediate. We think we might have seen one. The guides were telling us the plant that we saw that was just a stump had been taken by poachers. It obviously had been macheted. And so what they do is they'll machete them, cut them into pieces, and stick them in the ground, let them root, and they'll come back, and then they'll take the plant in the trade. So, you know, wild-grown plants have a price tag on them that's substantially higher. There's no real reason for that. So many nurseries grow them now, and they're available if you really want a Macrophylla. So always consult your sources. You know, if you're buying from Southeast Asia and you're importing, you know, odds might be that you're getting a poached plant. And so, you know, even with the restrictions, it happens. So we descended the mountain. We did other fun things while we had a day of rest. But like the fruit market, fantastic in the sense of there's just stuff. So we spent, you know, part of one afternoon just buying fruit and tasting it. Some of it was horrible. Other things are really good. What, this? It is a form of durian. So durian is not a singular thing, I learned. There's durian, which you find here, but there's like little durians, there's wild durians, there's red durians. There's, you know, like durians are popular, although most of the hotels that we stayed at had like little signs with like durian, you know, cross out. Durian, mangosteen, and what was the other one? Mangosteen, not because it stinks, but because it stains everything. It's like super red. But durian, the hotel owners don't want it because it's stinky. So it doesn't taste bad, but you have to sort of get past the smell. So yeah, this is mangosteen here. This outer part, you eat this white part, there's a seed in the middle of that. But this part stains like the dickens. Your fingers get red after all of it. Rambutan, it's like a lychee. Here we actually did get durian. All kinds of palm. I ate more things from palms that I've never experienced before. This is called snake fruit popularly. Again, not that great, but all right. This one was kind of good and sweet. I don't remember the name, but it was like some sort of weird palm. But we had a good time checking all that stuff out. And then we are on to Timbayukan, which is the second mountain, still in Malaysia, Borneo. Trying to see more species, again, very iconic. We started much lower on the mountain, so it was pretty warm at this point, but we were going to ascend higher. So even though we weren't going ultimately higher in ultimate elevation, you know, the total climb was a lot more. It was also more arduous. We had river crossings and things like that to get through. We had the guides, so they were incredible. These people were like phenomenal. I mean, of course, this is their job, so they do it on the routine. But these guys were carrying our packs, and I felt bad initially. And Stuart's like, "Oh, don't worry about it." They are making so much more money than they would make anywhere else locally by supporting the tourism that they do it, and they're carrying packs. So we just had to carry a much more minimal, food kind of and what water we wanted for that particular day. But they would race ahead, set up camp, all that sort of thing. Phenomenal people, and some of them would do it in flip-flops. I mean, it was like I would die. I would I would literally die. But they know what they're doing.
Greg,
Yes.
the guy in front, is he wearing snake leggings just in case, since he's in the
We'll
front?
get to that. That's one of the hazards, but not for snakes. It's for leeches. They had the fancy version of the leggings, so and I thought these were a little overblown, but in retrospect, I think it was a better idea because they were a denser weave than my socks, and you stick your pant legs into the socks because of the leeches, because they will crawl up. And so that was a way, because then you at least could maybe see them on your leg before they got anywhere. But anyway, we'll get to that in a minute. They would set up a base camp. They would cook for us. Nothing fancy. They'd poured up water. This was like the first day on Timba, Yukon. So we actually had fried chicken. So Kentucky Fried Chicken is a huge thing there. I don't think this is Kentucky Fried Chicken, but you would see signs for Kentucky Fried Chicken because it was popular. So we actually had fried meat. Otherwise, it was like hot dogs or Spam. And rice at every meal. I was like seriously tired of rice after a couple weeks. And some sort of vegetable. So thankful for food, yes, but it just really was like too much after a while.
No one ended up with any kind of parasites, hopefully, from eating all those different fruits.
No, I mean, they're not a source of parasites. Eating fish or things out of the stream without cooking properly is probably a bigger source. No mollusks out of the stream, that kind of stuff, unless you really like cook them. But fruit's not a problem. But there are plenty of hazards. So rattan, think of the furniture. This is rattan. It's a vining palm. So it goes everywhere, but it's covered with thorns. And so that helps it like grip onto things. And even its leaves arc over and are covered with thorns. And they have like thin whip-like tips that are covered with thorns. And they move around and they grip on another leaf branch or something, a leafy branch, and then allows basically to ratchet through the forest. But when they're overhanging a trail and you're trying to not fall, you have to really watch where you're gripping because you can get a handful of thorns pretty quickly. The other thing is humidity. So humidity is basically 100%. So on the descent from the mountain, I literally drank over a gallon of there's like blood all over the tent because one of the things leeches do is they not only, sure. They not only like, it's painless. At least the brown ones are painless. The tiger leeches you can feel, but the brown ones are painless, but they secrete an anticoagulant into the wound. So you keep bleeding, which is what they want to feed on, and you keep bleeding and bleeding and bleeding, and eventually it stops. Takes a while. So anyway, it looks a lot worse than it is, but that's a hazard, and it actually was better than I expected, because Stuart said that swine flu was introduced to Borneo, and it's devastated the wild pig population, and so he thinks that's a big natural source of food for the leeches. Humans, are there once in a while in the mountains, but not routinely. So anyway, we benefited, but he said in past when he's been there, there'd be like hundreds of leeches on your leg, and you have to like scrape them off. So anyway, you gotta love Nepenthes. So, keep going. I just include this because I didn't know where to stick it. Shingling plants, a lot of the epiphytes will go up and they have, a sort of a leafy running around phase, and then they go up the tree and they like plate out. These are very different species, but they all do the same thing, and it's called shingling, and it's pretty neat when you actually encounter it in person. But also lots of familiar stuff that you've either seen at Lowe's or wherever you like to buy plants. But then check out this tropical oak. That's a serious acorn, But then this alocasia, I think that's Capria, I wanted to wash off in a stream because I was so sweaty and gross after an entire day and a half. And then I'm like, oh look, there's an alocasia right there by the stream. Pothos. So a lot of these things are really familiar. You just haven't seen them, growing in a native context. But we kept ascending, and so this is a trail. In some cases, you weren't touching ground for quite some time. You were just working off elbow roots and stuff like that. And then, this is a trail too. I'm I think this is a trail. I'm just not sure. And so eventually it all worked out. It was great. We got closer and closer up to the top. Another bug. This is a bucket list bug, a trilobite beetle. So this is a fairly significantly sized beetle. What's interesting about it is this is the female. And it's huge. And this is the male, completely different, dimorphic, totally different body plans. The males weren't known for the longest period of time because the females are kind of spectacular when you see them. And nobody knew what the males looked like. And so they tied strings to the females, and so they couldn't crawl away, and they waited to see who would come by. And these guys came by, and very, very different. There's a bunch of species of trilobite beetles, but what's interesting about them is, it's basically neoteny. And so neoteny is juvenile characteristics in an adult animal. And so basically, the females never become what you would recognize as an adult beetle. They stay as a larva, and they just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so this is a larval form. It never, sheds its skin and goes into a pupa and becomes, a more conventional beetle. So the females are neotenized. They stay juvenile their entire life. So that's pretty cool. And this is a side. This is totally unnecessary for this talk, but I think it's interesting, is that neoteny may be the source of vertebrates. So our closest relatives, when you look at all the genetic data and everything, are actually tunicates. Tunicates are things commonly called sea squirts. They look like this. Basically, they sit on the sea floor or on a rock or a coral reef, and they start out as a larva that swims, and then it cements its head on a rock, and it transforms into something that basically just siphons water for the rest of its life. But what it thought is, and they actually have something that looks like a primitive backbone, or spinal cord, I should say, not really, no bones. What's thought is that this larval form became an adult form and eventually led to the first primitive vertebrates. And then that gave rise to things like, fish and everything else beyond that. So it's a pretty interesting story of form, but all the DNA sequencing, everything says these guys are our closest relatives that aren't actually vertebrates. So pretty darn cool at the end of the day. And the other side that you don't need to know, but I think is fascinating, is that these are the only animals known to produce cellulose. So that outer like sort of casing contains cellulose, and it doesn't come from a plant. It's a horizontal gene transfer from a bacterium. So the genetic form of that gene is actually bacterial in nature. So it picked it up way back when from a bacteria and uses cellulose, and no other animal produces cellulose. Anyway, there. Next trivia night, you're set. But anyway, further up the mountain, Burbigiae, charismatic species. The color, nice sort of milky picture, speckles, the whole 9 yards, a contrasty lip. Here's another picture. Somehow it got a lid knocked off. But you can see my hand, and it's just spectacular sitting there. Here's a smaller one, but basically Burbigiae, stunning. And it often takes this stripy appearance into its progeny. But here's the other big toothy species that we were hoping to see, Edwardsiana. So that goes through. Look at the teeth. That's dentition right there, serious. I didn't see juveniles again, but we saw plenty of them in the trees. But look at that. It's just stunning color, teeth, everything. This one also will utilize scat as a resource. So, it's there, but it's just, you can't not love it. And then the other iconic species next is Raja. So Raja, these are not large pictures. So Stuart thought that, based on the look of the plants, that they had experienced a droughtiness, which, for them is probably still moister than a lot of other things, but it was hard on the plants. So he said there were pictures like this, but he said, Raja is known for some of the largest pictures in the genus. And this big, swoopy lid, again, tree shrews are a common source of nutrient input for these guys. So all of these iconic species are utilizing this common resource. But we were able to see some, and this is a fresh picture. It hadn't probably colored up all the way. Small, but still, nonetheless, that sort of scalloped edge, it's distinctively Raja in form. Tentaculata, again, all the way up in the mountain where we're seeing these guys, Tentaculata, you could still find. Again, different forms, some with stripy peristomes, everything. We've got Selaginella and other things in there as well. Animals, I saw a snake, almost on the summit. I think it sat there because it was shedding its skin, so its eyes are milky. But this was the real, great thing was this plated millipede. Check it out. It's so cool. And this is not my photo. I didn't make it all the way to the summit. I was wearing out. It was seriously the most physically taxing thing I'd ever done. I don't think I'm in that bad a shape, but it was just tough. And I think that my real problem was I wasn't eating enough. So I was eating when I was hungry, and the calorie burn was insane. So that, I think, was more my problem. And I was worried about getting back down the mountain to the camp station where we were, because I didn't want to do that in the dark. And so I was trying to calculate my time. So I didn't go all the way to the summit. So Lance, one of the guys, took these next few photos. But this is the last species, Velosa. Here's Lance with it. He was in heaven. But again, the toothiest of the summit species, perhaps. But you can argue differently with Edwardsiana. But likes it cool. Really cool nights. It's a challenge to grow otherwise, but spectacular. we descended the mountain. Again, this is where I ran into trouble. So I looked like someone beat the crap out of me because I passed out twice at this point because I wasn't eating enough. And so I was like hiking, and then all of a sudden, we stopped. I was like not feeling well. And Stuart says, "You better sit." And then these nice folks came, and we like had, some good conversation and stuff. They were Malaysian, and so they, could speak enough English, and so we had a little bit of fun. But anyway, like I got up to leave, and I passed out. Like next thing I know, I'm like blotto on the ground. And so he said, "Here, eat this bag of Skittles." So I did that. Yeah, it's like, well, and so sat for a while, and I got up again to go down, and like the same thing happened. And so, and he goes, "Here, eat another bag of Skittles." And so like, I have enough Skittles in my body now. So it was tough, but they were really concerned because we had to get down the rest of the mountain before dark. And there were points where you had to be on your own, and falling would be a bad thing. So they're like, "No, let's make sure you're okay." So I like, that was tough, but I saw my iconic species. I saw the trilobite beetle, like all those things. And so we spent the night in Kota Kinabalu. Our last dinner, we went to the fish market. Everything, about it was what I wanted. I mean, the seafood was off the charts. And so Stuart just picked up a bunch of things, and we ate in the market and just tried all this stuff. Obviously, things like shrimp and lobster, pretty conventional, but the whelks and stuff like that, not my favorite, but it was good to try. But then we were going on to Palawan. So Palawan, fantastic. Even though Malaysia was relatively developed, Palawan was not. So people were still, these are bundles of rice plants that people were going to plant by hand. And there were spots where people were, plowing the fields with water buffalo. So tractors, no, things like that. People were hand planting this stuff. But it was so cool to see it in person. And this was our destination. We stayed in this resort before, the next leg of the trip. I decided to stay because I was just so wiped out, doing another mountain. I just couldn't. So the next pictures the pictures I'll show you of the actual Nepenthes. And there was only one species I wanted to see. So I figured I could let go and sit on a beach. The beach was cool. I don't know if you know mangroves, but they germinate on the tree and they fall off and then they embed. And so this is actually the root of the seedling, and there's the fruit up there. And this little crab. All this stuff here is like little balls that the crabs dig up and sift through, and they kick it out, and then they dig up the next little ball of sand and siphon out food. So good biology everywhere. Some aquatic palm. I'd never seen an aquatic palm, so this species is found throughout Southeast Asia. This will detach and float, and so areas that are basically salty, freshwater estuaries are filled with these palms. And it it creeps along the ground and sends its palm fronds up from below the water surface. But these are pictures from the folks that actually did go up Victoria, so it was long and slopey. Getting to the summit, Philippinensis is the first thing that they saw. It's really, not that fascinating of a species when you've been dazzled by the other ones, but it's nice, it's cute. But Mount Victoria summit was really where people wanted to be for the rest of that expedition. Here's some of the guides eating dinner. But this is Attenborough, so named after David Attenborough. Stuart and a few other folks were on an expedition that actually discovered this, so they found it. One of the larger species, and just a lot of interesting variation around that, but gorgeous. And then we were ready to depart. Went back to Puerto Princesa. We had to fly out to Manila, and from Manila homeward. I was like totally baked at this point. It was just like, I am done. So fortunately, we flew Japan Airlines, so the lounge was fantastic, and there was a shower. It was great. So anyway, I think that's it. I've like almost gone an hour and a half, but
That was wonderful.
that's it. That's it.
Do you mind if I ask the financial question?
Sure.
How much did all of that cost? Thousands of dollars.
Yeah, thousands. I think the expedition itself was 3,500 a person, something like that.
Yes, it seems reasonable, it's really reasonable.
I mean, it wasn't bad, and you know that was like once we were going, it was like all of the transportation, all of the food, everything. So once you were there, so the flights themselves, not cheap because we flew business. It's like I had to sleep, but you know once you were there, inexpensive in terms of you know on the ground food costs. Like when we stayed at the resort. You know, we hired a driver to like go to some more distant destinations where we could see national park stuff in Palawan. You know, we had a driver for the entire day. I think we paid them like $60, something like that, for a whole day. And that was probably a really good wage for them. Because there, you know, like, you know, it was electrified and so forth, but that basically meant you had like one LED bulb in your, you know, sort of metal sheet shack. You know, that was like the standard. So very, very different economic scales during the course of the trip from Singapore to Palawan.
How long was the total trip?
The expedition itself was almost 2 weeks, I think 13 days. But then we bookended that with, you know, a couple days in each before and after just to recover. Rob was a trooper. He was a trooper. He went because he knows my love of plants. So he was a good supportive spouse. He did not actually go up the mountains. He went up to the way station on the first day, and we went a little bit further just to sort of see what the off boardwalk hiking was like. And he was like, no. And so Stuart was really wonderful. Stuart, like, you know, had a guide. So like I don't think I had any pictures of Tam, one of the, like the mastermind that like does a lot of the groundwork for Stuart in terms of booking hotels and stuff. You know, arrange, you know, like some local trips and things like that. So he had stuff to do while I was on the mountain. And then, you know, I came down and was like covered with, I looked horrible. And he said, you stink. And, you know, so, but he was a trooper. He was supportive. Let's put it that way. He liked Singapore.